But without further ado, then we'll get into world building. And I might go through this quickly, and if we do, just jot down some questions, no problem coming back to previous slides. So one of the first questions you might ask yourself is, when do you build your world? And a lot of that is based on who you are as a writer. Are you a planner or are you a pantser? Do you like to have everything done ahead of time before you start? Or do you like to just jump in, dive in, and not be held back by things like having to research everything in the world first? Usually it ends up being a mix, and there's pros and cons, to both sides. Like if you start before, you can maybe visualize your world better, but on the other hand, maybe that creativity gets slowed down and it might be hard for you to get going after you've done all your research. If you do it while you're writing, kind of just in time, you get what you need when you need it, but it could interrupt things. And of course, you could always have rewrites that you have to do, because you could be halfway through your book when all of a sudden you decide, it's a desert world. And so then you have to go all the way back to the beginning and change things. So for me personally, I like to have a bit of a mix of everything. I like to go and do some research and get a feel for the world that I'm in. And then once I get going, then I would research just specific questions I have. So for example, on my Marat story, I started trying to write it, and I had my character walking down a street, but like, was it a street? Was it paved? Was it, cobblestone? Was it just dirt? And I really wasn't sure, because I wasn't sure what all they had back then. And what diseases did they have? Like, so I would write through and I maybe said, well, a pandemic hits and wipes out part of the population. And then later I would do more research and come back and decide, well, it was whooping cough. And then I would know that, people would be coughing a lot, kind of a thing. So that's kind of just your basic when to build your world. Then I wanted to show you some world building aids. And I'm not really providing you much here, because if you go out on the internet and just Google world building, you're going to get a lot of results on questions. And usually it's like 100 questions, 150 questions, 1,000 questions to ask yourself when, you're building your world, what you should think about. There's also software for world building. I have down here. Often the software is for writers and gamers, because gamers and developers, they want to build a world and they're asking themselves much the same questions. And of course, you can also read books and articles about the time period. So the next thing, this is really small text, but what I did is I took that first link, and it's 131 questions. Here's all the questions. And it's just going through and asking you things to consider. And I would say, get a list, see if it pertains to you, drop the questions that don't seem worthwhile, get a few lists, add questions that end up being necessary for you. And I didn't really mention this, but if you're doing a short story, a lot of times you have enough of an idea of the world in your head that you don't have to do as much research as if you're doing like a novel, right? You can, 500 words, you probably don't have to do a whole lot of research, but a whole novel, definitely. So the questions are broken down into groups like physics and nature, geography, magic and religion, population, language and gestures, world and culture, and then celebrations, education, family. I don't know. This is kind of a funky list if you ask me, but like food and dining is kind of important, because your people are going to eat and you're going to want to know what are they eating. And so these questions, if you think about it, they're just to get you to think about your world, right? Like, well, what is it? What takes place in that? And a lot of the notes that you write down or that you discover are never going to be on the page, or maybe less than 10% are going to make it to the page. But you're going to get to a point where if somebody comes up to you and says, what's your character's favorite color? You'll say blue. They'll say, so they're a farmer, and you'll say yes. They'll say, what do they grow? And you're going to know. You'll say squash. They grow squash, right? or whatever it is. But if you answer these questions, it'll force you to think about those things. And you'll know that, oh yeah, the reason they're growing squash is because we're in the future and there aren't very many crops that are sustainable anymore, and there's only 4 different varieties, and squash is the best that works where this person lives. She happens to live here. This is the rainfall, and she has a bigger bonus for producing squash than if she had gone with peanuts or something else, right? So going through these questions kind of help you understand that. Maybe she needs a formal education to grow squash because it's more difficult, things like that. So getting to know your world better. So those 130 questions or so are really kind of just the beginning, right? You also need to think about mechanics. On the macro level, how does the world work? How do people feed, clothe, and shelter themselves? What are the main industries, religion, politics, and struggles? Now, if your world, say it's modern day, maybe you're set in the United States, so you don't maybe have to think globally, but you might have other regions of the world that impact your world. So if your world can be impacted, like if there's different countries that are at war, or your character is traveling, or if there's espionage, then you have to think on that slightly larger scale. Natural consequences, if it's an agrarian society and there's wars and crops get ruined, then people are going to starve, right? One thing that I read in a book was very interesting. It was kind of like, there's these bandits, always, sci-fi stories or fantasy stories have all these bandits. Well, if bandits are always attacking and pillaging and plundering, then farmers really aren't going to take the time. Either they're all out of business or their farms have been razed. So how does that really work long term? It doesn't, logically or in natural consequence wise. Logical issues is that, your reader will suspend their disbelief to a certain extent, but you can't make them do too many big leaps, right? You should kind of have things that you understand. If I go back in time and I kill my parents, how can I continue to exist, right? Just kind of questions like that. Like, does your logic flow naturally? If you have a spy movie or a murder mystery, can you go from A to B? Do you have, the person and the weapon that was used? Does it all make sense that it all could have happened and it did happen? That it logically makes sense when you think about it overall instead of just in the story. Relative to reality, how close do you want to keep it? Do you want a murder mystery that is like NCIS, where all of the details are looked at, or a cozy mystery that's more like Jessica Fletcher? Each one of those may require you to do more research. As far as if it's NCIS, then you have to have all the terminology and the jargon. If it's Jessica Fletcher, you can kind of just float over a lot of those details. And then timelines, if it's set in the real world, do any real world events impact your story? Like if you had a story that was in 2020, it'd be very hard to write that without putting in COVID in some way, shape, or form. So those are things to think about as you think about your story. If there's things that you don't know or you can't find out, you might want to interview somebody or talk to somebody else who does know those things. I have a journalism major, so even though I have a journalism major and I have interviewed a number of people, it can still be kind of scary. But every time I've asked somebody, they've been very pleased or happy to help me out. I generally do basic research on my subject area. Like for the museum piece, I interviewed a curator, a museum curator, and I explained a little bit about what my plot was and asked them to explain to me what it would be like from the museum's side, things that weren't quite correct about my idea or not. Make sure you have a list of questions ready and keep loose control of the interview. Things might come up that you don't realize. And It might not be the answer that you thought, or it might be something that is just way out of left field. And go ahead and, follow that for a little bit. Try to get most of your questions answered. It's also good to ask their likes and dislikes. As far as, oh, I always see love stories and I just hate it when blah, 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 blah. It's kind of nice to know that it might not impact your story, but it makes them feel like you're listening to them a little bit more.